got a fun afternoon planned for you. The morning was all focused on bees and honey, uh, as an ingredient. Now we're going to the science behind honey and then formulating it. And we're also going to throw it over to Richard and Melina just to tell a little bit about their personal experiences. But let's dig right in with talking about honey as an ingredient, as it would be used in your bakery. The first place to start is really in the definition of the ingredient. And, there's not it's pretty crazy. There's not a standard of identity for honey yet. It's something we've been trying to persuade our government to do for many, 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 many years. And there's not an official standard of definition. So what we use is a couple things. What's kind of worldwide, the official definition is from Codex Alimentarius, and that defines honey as basically a 100% pure substance. It's something that does not have anything added to it, whether that's a flavoring. It can include no manipulation of the ingredient whatsoever. If we look at the technical definition, if you skew more on the food science side, we're talking about a supersaturated liquid, something with more than 181 components. So compared to a lot of other sweeteners you may use in your bakery foods, honey by far is going to be the most complex, not only in its makeup and its varietals, but just in the sheer amount of things that are happening in honey. And if you're looking for something to tell your consumers, it's just honey. It's this all natural and unprocessed ingredient that's made in a beehive. So it's a pretty inspirational definition. I talked a little bit about this early, but I think it's good to reframe the creation of honey and keep on stressing over and over that the bees are the ones doing all the work. We call them the world's smallest little chemists. We've never figured out how to get a actual white jacket, lab jacket on a bee. But if we could, it would show basically the enzymatic process that they are triggering that's breaking down that sucrose into fructose and glucose. And this breaking down of sucrose into glucose and fructose is really something that gives honey all of its trademark characteristics, from the amount of sugars in it to the plethora of types of sugars in it to the water content to that small 1%. If you look at kind of that 40,000 foot view of what honey is, you're going to get a substance that's about 82% carbohydrates. If you pull that 17% water out, you're going to get something that's 99% carbohydrates. So that carbohydrate load is pretty heavy. But what makes it unique compared to other sweeteners, where it may just have one type of carbohydrate in it, honey has upwards of 20 different types of sugars inside of it. The big ones are your fructose and glucose, but then it all has all sorts of other trisaccharides and even higher sugars that play a huge role in the flavor. And then you've got that 1%. So you've got acids, minerals, vitamins, wild yeast and bacteria, as well as enzymes that are also going to play a role in not only the flavor, but in the functionality of honey whenever it comes to the bakery foods. But the big one is really that kind of sugar to water combination, because that sugar to water, so that 82 to 17%, is what really is giving honey its trademark attributes, which can be considered a positive or a negative depending on who you are. We always find whenever we do consumer surveys, one of the things that consumers like least about honey is that it's sticky, and the other thing that consumers love most about honey is that it's sticky and its consistency. So depending on how you look at it, it can be either good or bad. But this sort of concentration of multiple sugar types really gives honey its trademark viscosity, as well as its tendency to granulate. It also gives it its humectancy, which is really important whenever we think about it. Because honey is going to basically suck in every amount of moisture as it can from its environment. It's a highly, highly humectant ingredient. This is great in a lot of bakery foods that we'll talk about later, because it's going to keep your crumb a lot moisture for a lot longer time and really prevent kind of the drying out of that crumb. This combination of sugars to low water activity also kind of gives it immunity from spoilage. While we can't technically say honey lasts forever, In theory, it should. It may not taste as good over time. It's going to lose some of its flavor, but it should last forever just due to the low amount of water activity with the high amount of sugars as well as the acids in it. But let's get started with sugars because they do make up the lion's share of what's in honey. So let's do a little sugar 101 because this is going to help us kind of look at all these sugars in a different way. So our main sugar that we see out in the world is sucrose or table sugars. What that is a disaccharide. So we've got two sugar monomers, a fructose and a glucose. Those two combine and we've got a disaccharide. Now those fructose and glucose are the two main sugars inside honey, but they're not bound together, so they're called monosaccharides. We also have all sorts of other higher sugars that you may be familiar with, things such as maltose and maltotriose, which is a trisaccharide, so 3 glucose molecules bound together. Why all this matters is that's going to play a significant role in terms of the sweetness of the product, the ratio of these sugars and what types of sugars they have. Not only the sweetness, but the complexity of it. Your two main sugars are those fructose and glucose. Fructose is going to be about 38% of the carbohydrate load of honey, whereas glucose is going to be about 31%. If we look at the sweetness of those two sugar components compared to just table sugar or sucrose, you're going to see that fructose is significantly sweeter than sucrose, and glucose is a little less sweet than sucrose. Combined, all these sugars together is going to give you a Brix of 70 to 88. Why we have that range is because, as you know, honey is if you think about it, it's a livestock ingredient. It's an agricultural product. It's made from bees. So depending on where the bees forage for food, you're going to have different kind of ratios of those main components. This is really evident whenever you look at kind of 3 different varietals of honey, all 3 of which we tasted today. You've got your alfalfa, which is 39 to 33%. Buckwheat is 35 to 29, which is why you don't get that perception of sweetness as much from that buckwheat, because it has a little less fructose and a little less glucose. So it's got sort of kind of a different ratio. It's also why you see the Tupelo never crystallizing. So what's happening in crystallized honey is that glucose is basically falling out of solution and binding to another glucose molecule or a speck of dust, maybe an air bubble. And because there's such a low glucose amount, that's why you see that Tupelo always staying in that liquid format. But it is kind of important to know whenever you're baking, dependent on the varietal of honey you use, you're not only going to have differences in terms of kind of flavors, but in overall sweetness as well. This is something we taste a lot whenever we're doing these in person, and Richard and Melina run a great granola test where we bake 5 different types of granola with 5 different types of honey, and everybody judges their favorite and everything. And it's really interesting to see what happens to, these products after they go through baking. And now some honeys that people don't like, not to put a spotlight on Allison, but I know she does not like buckwheat honey whatsoever, but her favorite year after year is the buckwheat granola we make. So it's just interesting to see how those different things come through in a finished product. Compared to other sweeteners that you use in your bakery, you're going to get an ingredient whenever you talk about honey that's going to be anywhere from 1.1 to 1.5 times sweeter than sugar, dependent on the varietal you use. So what this means is your kind of first formulation tip is whenever you substitute honey for another sweetener, make sure you're not overdoing it on the honey. If you're replacing it with sugar, it's something to where you're not going to want to do a 1-to-1 replacement because you're going to get something that could potentially be oversweet. Generally, you can cut back a little bit on that level of sweetness, reduce your overall sweetener count to accommodate for kind of that difference. Outside of sweeteners, the next big component that we need to talk about whenever we talk about honey and acids. And this can surprise a lot of people because whenever you think of honey, you don't naturally think of an acidic ingredient. But if you think about it, we had some of those honeys that had tasting notes, especially the orange blossom that we tasted first, where we did get some of those comments about how there was a slight acidity to it, or maybe some citrus flavor. If you think about honey and acids and compare it to the pH scale, so if you look at the pH scale, the lower the number, the more acidic it is. So a battery obviously is one of the most acidic things you can have, so it has a pH of 0, compared to drain cleaner or bleach, which are very alkaline. They're not acidic, they're alkaline, so they have super high numbers. People are surprised to figure out where honey goes on this list, and it actually fits right in between vinegar and tomato. So honey has a pH of 3.9. That means it's a pretty acidic ingredient. This acidity is why we can all eat these wonderful honeys and not worried about the bacteria and wild yeast. And honey by itself, the acidity level is so high that those bacteria, those wild yeast that are in there, are dormant. They're never reproducing. They're never active. So consuming it is not something that's going to harm us. It is something why we say, though, you shouldn't give honey to anybody under the age of 1 year old, because their immune system hasn't developed, and that sort of bacteria that's left in there may sort of impact them, get them sick or something like that. But why these acids are so important, everybody here has culinary backgrounds. How many times have we heard that acid equals flavor? And really with honey, it's true. Acids only account for 0.5% of the solids in honey, but the contribution to flavor is really, really immeasurable whenever you think about it. This acidity is also why honey doesn't spoil. And also why it helps prevent mold whenever you use it in bakery foods, is because it has a precursor to hydrogen peroxide inside of honey that prevents mold, prevents spoilage, and all these other things that we don't want in our bakery foods. Taking a closer look at our acids, you see a whole big bunch of them. Everything from organic acids and aromatic acids to lactones and amino acids. Whenever we look at the big ones that are going to have the most impact in the flavor of your honey or the flavor of the bakery foods is really something called gluconic acid. Gluconic acid is an organic acid. What gluconic acid does is it has this really kind of complex flavor profile where it starts sweet initially and then sort of kind of develops into a more acidic flavor. It's one of the main acids whenever Allison was tasting the sourwood, how she calls it a pucker honey, where you kind of get that freshness, that zip at the end. That's that gluconic acid really kind of pulling everything together. Now, this not only works great in honey, but chefs and bakers and even beer brewers have discovered that this gluconic acid also has an uncanny ability to elevate certain flavors inside of formulas. So what this gluconic acid does with things such as rosemary, thyme, think of your main herbs, as well as if you brew beer on the side or are a home brewer, certain hops. This gluconic acid has the ability to basically enhance the aromas and flavors of those things. It's why a lot of salad dressings that you see use honey in them. They're not using honey for that sweetness. They're using honey to kind of pull all the ingredients together in a formula and really boost certain notes, such as herbal notes. And that's what honey really does a great job of, in that gluconic acid. These acids also really help honey from overwhelming a formula. We've all had formulas. We've all, made stuff that has been a little too cloyingly sweet. Yes, you can make a product with honey that is going to be cloyingly sweet, but it's definitely a lot harder to do because honey really has that ability to kind of balance out formulas and sit in the background without dominating them. It's why it's an ingredient that's used so much throughout food and beverage usage. So these acids play such a large role whenever you think about using the ingredient in the formula. And this balance of kind of sweetness and acidity kind of works on both types of products. So, a lot of this information is basic, but I think it is interesting to think about whenever you're building a formula, how we balance sweetness, bitterness, and sourness whenever we use honey. This was a study we did many, many, many years ago, but it's still relevant. But It's kind of what you would think. If you add honey to an existing sweet product, you're going to increase the sweetness intensity considerably. Addition of 25% to a 5% sucrose is going to more than double that sweetness. So a little bit of honey goes a long way because it is such a sweet ingredient. On the bitterness side, if you're using bitter ingredients and you don't want them too much, it's something you can decrease the bitterness of by using honey. It's something that on the brewing side, I know I bring up brewing a lot, but outside of baking, brewing is really the #2 market for us. A lot of heavily hopped beers are using honey in them now because it elevates the aromatics of those hops while toning down on sort of those rough bitter notes of it too. So honey's going to do that in a formula, is it's going to kind of lessen the bitterness of those things. And on a sourness side too, it's going to mellow that out as well without overwhelming it with sweetness. So this was a study that looked about how adding just a little bit of honey is going to significantly decrease the sourness of a product. So it's not only used as something to boost sweetness, but it's also an ingredient that can be used to balance out either bitter or sour notes in one of your formulas without overwhelming them. So the sugars and acids are obviously the main components, but we also have lots of other components, which I'm going to go over briefly. You've got VOCs in honey. These are things, especially in your monofloral honey, that really show that fingerprint of where that honey is from. Whether it's furfural, which indicates that it's coming from a fruity or more of a nut source, or something such as benzene acid, which indicates, it's got this ripe fruit and spiciness that it's adding to the honey and really connoting where that honey came from. We also have enzymes, which may right now be triggering warning alerts inside of your heads of, okay, if I add enzymes, I know there's all sorts of enzymatic reactions happening already in the products I make, but what's going to happen if I add in enzymes from honey and how it's going to impact? There's 4 different types of enzymes in honey, but really the one that you have to think about whenever you use honey is amylase or diastase. What this is this is a enzyme that's found in pollen, and what it does is it basically converts starches to dextrins and sugars. Now, the role this can play in bakery foods is either good or bad. 99% of the honeys you buy is going to be a good thing. Amylase is going to be a source of sugar for those yeast. It's going to, improve flavor, crust color, and moisture retention. All those wonderful things are going to happen with 99% of the honey. However, there are some high amylase honeys out there. And unfortunately, we have no way to determine how. We know a lot of things about honey and a lot of things about honeybees, but why certain honeys are higher in amylase than others is something we have not been able to determine. What can happen if you get a high amylase honey is it can make the dough overly sticky. It can create large holes in the bread, essentially kind of change that profile of that bake that you normally get, mainly on the crumb structure. In my 9 years of doing this, I've only had one baker have a problem with this, and this was a large commercial bakery. They were cranking out thousands and thousands and thousands and thousands of loaves of white bread a day, and they switched honey suppliers. And their new honey supplier was selling them a honey that had a higher amylase content, and it completely kind of messed up the crumb structure of what was a tight, dense sandwich loaf. And started creating holes where they never had it before. Again, I don't want to act like this is a major concern, but it is something we bring up, that if you are using honey and you notice that you're getting the dough stickier, larger holes in the bread, that is something to troubleshoot, whether it's a high amylase honey. Some of the other things in honey at a much smaller level are these 1%ers, so things such as vitamins. It's got all sorts of B vitamins as well as C vitamins. We've got all these great minerals from calcium to zinc. And we also have antioxidants in honey, which make it unique. Unfortunately, all these things are at small levels, so it's not like we can say, eat this loaf of honey bread and get all your daily source of calcium and B vitamins and antioxidants. They're not at the levels where we can put any kind of claim on it, but it all part of just distinguishes honey and really helps tell that story. And we also have in honey is 1%, there's a bunch of microbes in there. So everything from bacteria to wild yeast. On the baking side, it's nothing you have to worry about. Where we see this being a big issue is on the non-alcoholic beverage side as well as the beer side, just because they're putting it in a solution that's changing the pH and could start replicating those wild yeast and bacteria inside of that honey and create an environment where they may be able to grow. But from a bakery side, it's nothing you have to worry about. Moving to handling honey, which is a great thing about honey, other than the stickiness factor. But if stored properly, honey is never going to go bad, which is a really, really great thing. You want to store it at room temperature. You don't want to put it near anything that there's going to be great fluctuations in the heat. So don't put it near the oven where the oven's on and it gets hot, and then it cools down and then it gets cold. Every kind of temperature fluctuation has the ability to essentially burn off some of those VOCs, some of those really volatile flavor compounds that you want to preserve in your honey so it makes it through. The big thing is keeping that container airtight. If there is any moisture, if you leave that container open, it's going to start grabbing in all that moisture. Honey only has to increase in moisture content from 17 to 18% to start fermentation. If there's a large yeast count or you have a lot of wild yeast in your air at your bakery, which most probably do, you're going to start triggering fermentation with just a 1% increase in moisture content. If you leave it open for a long time, if it gets up to 20% moisture, fermentation is going to start happening. You don't want that unless you're trying to create a mead or doing something on the culinary side where you would want a fermented honey. I know Richard does as well. We ferment garlic inside honey, which is a pretty magical thing to do, as well as other ingredients. But for just traditional honey, you don't want that fermenting. So you want to make sure that container is really airtight. If your honey does crystallize, it's something that you shouldn't have to worry about. Your honey supplier should be selling you honey that you don't have to worry about it. If it does, you do have to heat it up to make it in a liquid format. This is something that we do on our end with sous vide machines. We basically plop that honey in a bag, set the temperature at 145. 20 minutes later, we have a perfectly liquid ingredient. You could do it with just a regular water bath, meaning pipe hot water into a container and then put your honey into it, and you're going to slowly get that.